Well, that's the title of the talk, which you're already aware of. I'm going to concentrate on oil pollution and the surrounding issues. Many of you are far too young to remember the TORREY Canyon, which was the first major spill incident in the UK, as you can see, back in ’67. The Amoco Cadiz was a huge spill off the coast of France. As you can see, nearly 250,000 tonnes of oil spilled. The Brer was a local one here in the UK, in Shetland. The Shetland are islands at the north of Scotland. They are part of Scotland, for those who would like to know. Then the Sea Empress, which also took place in Wales. And you can see the figures of the quantities of oil spilled. It's really quite a lot of oil. That is a press picture of the TORREY Canyon, and you'll see from that she's an old-fashioned design of ship with the bridge and accommodation midships, and the engineers well placed down aft, out of the way. But a few other spills are worth my mentioning. One is the Tribulus. She wasn't a tanker, she was a bulk carrier, and she nearly fell to pieces, and she came into Bantry Bay. Now, she did not spill a lot of oil, but it just took less than 100 tonnes to go round. Bantry Bay is an inlet in the west of Ireland, and the clean-up there was as expensive as had it been a huge spill. And it just brings it home, it's not just tankers that spill oil. I mentioned the Rose Bay because that's another interesting incident. This was a tanker that was at anchor off the south coast of England. Unfortunately, it was the day when the FA Cup final took place, and the fishing boat that hit her, they were all watching the television, it is said. But because the oil came from a tanker, the polluter pays principle applied. So the poor old P&I club involved had to pay up for what was extensive clean-up. I mentioned the Irving Whale because she sank it in 1970, but it wasn't until 1997 that she was raised. 4,000 tonnes of oil in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And you'll all be aware that Canada likes to keep its environment crystal clear. Now, I've put the Sanchi in there for a very simple reason. I can't really talk about it. Fortunately, I did get a little bit of a hint from a senior level, is that the cargo on the Sanchi, this is the tanker that had the collision in the China Sea, her cargo was condensate, and it was not a persistent oil. And I'll be talking about the CLC convention in a few minutes. I mention the Sanchi because it is possible that had the Hazardous and Noxious Substance Convention been in force, that might have applied to that cargo. Now, that's a personal opinion, but it's just worth mentioning that even now, things in the pollution world are open to question and are changing. That's a ship aground, as you can see, the Brer. That was taken just a few hours after she grounded. She broke up completely in a very short period of time, and all the oil cargo was spilled. Now, you may not be able to see that, but it's an old slide, but I just wanted you to appreciate what Malcolm has just said, that the quantity of oil from ships entering the sea is diminishing very rapidly. And this slide you've already seen. This is from ITOF, and I'll mention them a little bit about them later on, because they're a very important player in the pollution response. But as you can see, that by the bottom, that's 2012, but actually since then it's hardly changed. The spillage of oil from ships has diminished, mainly because of the international pressure on pollution, and now they're looking at other things. This is another notorious case, the Prestige. I will not offer any commentary on that, other than that was taken when, in my opinion, she was solvable. Now, when there is an incident involving oil pollution or the threat of oil pollution, in my opinion, this is the most important international convention. And I'll read it out because I don't like the English. The International Convention on Oil Pollution Preparedness, Response and Cooperation. Those of you who learnt your English in the United States will be aware the word preparedness is an Americanism which managed to get itself into the international circuits. And that reminds me to say to you, if English is my first language, I know for many of you here it is not. So if I'm talking too quickly, please stand up and tell me to slow down. But I will try and keep it so you understand. Now, I'll call it OPRC. When there is an incident, this is a convention that will be in force. And what it requires, number one point, is the onboard plan has to be in the ship's working language. Now, if I tell you that some ships have up to 40 languages spoken on board, what is the working language? But it's the working language of the people who would be responsible for the shipboard response. That's very sensible. I'll be talking a little bit about OPA 90, that's Oil Pollution Act, United States, 1990, where there is a requirement that the onboard response plan is in English. And you can have a completely non-English speaking crew, but the response plan, if you're going to the States, must be in English. I suppose that's so the American Coast, any American Coast Guards here? No, so the American Coast Guard can have some idea what is supposed to happen. All tankers over 150 tons it applies to, and other ships over 400 tons. But more importantly, there has to be a contact list with point of contact. Now, in my experience, when there is an incident, the first thing that makes it work or not is communication. And you must know who you should be talking to, and are you talking to the right person? Let me give you a little example. When there's an incident, the local people, responders, like to maybe play up their importance. And you can spend a lot of time talking to somebody who you think might be in charge, and you find he's the T-boy because he's not wearing a uniform, and you waste an awful lot of time and effort. So this is an important feature to make sure that the people who are responding are talking to the right people in the government and the authorities of the state involved. And the other thing that has to be is a detailed action plan. Now that's very easy to say, but how do you make a detailed action plan for something you don't know exactly what is going to happen? And OPA 90 has the same problem with salvage in the States. You have to have detailed plans, but you don't know what you're planning against, I think. The governments have a responsibility. It took, dare I say, it took governments quite a long time to start complying with the requirements of OPRC. They have to have pre-positioned equipment. Now that sounds very complicated. What it means is that spill response equipment has to be somewhere. Now in the UK, a lot of it is based in the west coast of Wales in a place called Pembroke, because the Pembroke and Milford Haven import 25% of the UK oil. Therefore, there's a jolly good chance you're going to have an incident there, particularly as the port entrance is not very friendly. And indeed, when the Sea Empress occurred, that's exactly what happened. And this pre-positioned equipment was mobilized almost immediately. To be fair, it was never actually used very much, But that's an important point of government roles. Program of training. Now, again, after any major incident in any country, there's a huge reaction. Everyone says, oh, we must train about this. And this goes on for a couple of years. And then gradually, there's no more spills. The budget people in the government say, well, why are we spending this money? And it gradually gets less and less and less. Communications I've already mentioned. And coordination. At the end of the day, coordination is the key. If I tell you on one case, we had UK, France, Spain, the Netherlands and Ireland all part of the response operation. And that required, as you might imagine, a lot of coordination, but it worked. And as resources were not needed, so they were told that we weren't needed anymore. But it was a very good example of international cooperation. And I think we'll still see that in the future, and not just in pollution incidents, because any big incident, as we have seen in other cases, will require an international response. That just shows you what a tanker looks like when it's blowing up and spilling oil. It is horrific, I can assure you. Some of you may have heard of a ship called the ERIKA. I won't go into the details of that, but that was her final moments, which appeared on French television. Now, broadening the subject just very slightly, just for a few minutes, I don't expect you to read that. But when there is an incident, you can have all these various people attending. Representatives from reinsurers, insurers, hull and machinery, P&I, but for cargo, for ship, for charterers. And there was a case I was involved in, which wasn't a tanker. The ship had broken in half, and when the surviving half was taken into the port of refuge, 47 lawyers and surveyors turned up. And that in itself was a major problem. Allowing access to the ship, controlling access to the ship. In fact, I spent one casualty. My job was to control access to the ship. And people go, and this is something to bear in mind, people who are responding as surveyors, lawyers, consultants, will very often not think about their own safety in order to gain one over the next chap. And in one case, we had to throw him off the ship and ban him because he was putting his own life at risk. That's his business. But what was important was he was also putting other people's lives at risk. And that's unforgivable in my book. Safety of life at sea is, in my opinion, the top priority. There's no compromise to that, although you wouldn't think so. If I tell you in 1990, I know I'm going back a bit, but when the Brer happened, it hit the headlines in the papers for about 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, yes, it was a bad winter, 312 mariners lost their life. That got 3 column inches in the press. So very often safety of life is not the media's top priority. Sorry to go on about that, but it is a point that I think we should all bear in mind. IMO has certain requirements. I've summarised them all just a little bit here. The first one is they need to know where is the spill. Sounds a bit obvious really, doesn't it? But they need to know where it is. But they also must have a list of what equipment is available at the location and what other states are able to provide, which is what we saw in the Sea Empress case. Equipment from all the other countries was mobilized. And the other important part is that IMO need to have a copy of each member's state's contingency plan. I think they have got them all now, but it's taken a number of years for that to actually be fulfilled. So I think we can confidently now say that IMO do hold a good record of the contingency plans for all their member states. Now, excuse me, another important convention, some would say it's the most important, and you will come across it, is MARPOL, the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And as you can see, this goes back many, many years. 1973 is when it first came in. 154 states at the last count have MARPOL provisions in their internal law. It came into force, as you can see, in '83. And I mentioned the 6 annexes. We simply do not have time today to go through each of the 6 annexes. So I do, if you have an interest in this area, go to the Google or IMO website, and you will get a detail of each of the 6 annexes and what subjects they address. And that really is quite important if you are involved in pollution prevention and pollution response, because then it might give you a bit of an understanding as to why the authorities and government in an area are reacting the way they are. And that's quite an important issue. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes, well not even minutes, on OPA 90, the Oil Pollution Act 1990. Again, most of you here are far too young to remember the Exxon Valdez, but you may have heard of the Exxon Valdez. She ran aground in Alaska and spilt a very modest 37,000 tons. And it's an awful lot of oil. But you'd have thought she'd spilt 100,000 tons. But the reaction, those of you who've been cruising and know Alaska will be well aware of how pristine they like to think the place is. So the incident occurred, as you can see, on the 24th of March, 1989. Unbelievably to the international community, the law was passed just over a year later, and it came into force in '93. Now that might sound a long time, but in law, for the lawyers amongst you, that's very quick. And the international, I'm not going to go into the detail of OPA 90, again, that's something you might want to research yourself. But the OPA 90 was treated with a great deal of suspicion by the international community at the time. To be fair, it seems to work very well. And in fact, the OPA 90 model rivals the IMO models that we've just talked about. And many countries have now followed the OPA 90 route rather than OPRC and MARPOL. And it's something just to bear in mind. So when you have an incident, do try and understand what the authorities are working on when they're reacting. OPA 90's worked very well. I did mention it in the salvage context. That came in to effect 4 or 5 years ago now, where salvors have to prepare plans for any ship, and any ship owner sending a ship to the States must have a salvor on their books with a pre-prepared salvage plan. And that's great, but you don't know what the incident's going to be, but that's another issue. I'm going to talk, many of you here, you can go to sleep now because you'll know all too well about the P&I clubs, but for those of you who perhaps don't, and if I get this slightly wrong, please forgive me, but essentially the P&I clubs look at the third-party indemnification. And it's a bit like with your car, in the UK at least, you have to have third-party insurance. You don't have to have hull and machinery insurance for your car, that's your problem, but you must have third-party. So if you knock an old lady down on a zebra crossing, you have to have cover for that. I'm not suggesting you do it, but The clubs operate on an individual club, it's mutual. So if one ship owner has a major problem, then all the members of that club will chip in. And there are systems where that goes out to the group clubs and then into the reinsurance. If I tell you the Costa Concordia, which may be a casualty that many of you are familiar with, and I'm open to correction here, but the total cost to the market for that was about $2.5 to $3 billion for a ship that was built for the cost of 700 million. And the market here absorbed that. In fact, I suspect, and the market quite likes having these problems occasionally, because it justifies their existence, but it also gives them an excuse to maintain a premium at a level that they can withstand. There are 13 groups in the 13 clubs in the international group. That's just a club of clubs, really. And there are quite a few non-international group clubs. Again, if you want more information than that, can I suggest you Google it, because there's a huge amount of detail. The P&I system on the mutual basis is flexible. So if the club runs out of money before the year end, it passes the hat round again. And everyone's asked to put more money in. In theory, at least, if there's money left over at the end of the year, then that money is handed back to the owners. And that does actually happen from time to time. There are a number of clubs, and some of them are part of the mutual system, who have fixed premium. There's nothing a ship owner accountant likes more than knowing what his costs are going to be. Therefore, if you have a fixed premium, you know how much your insurance is going to cost. It's a bit of a gamble, like most of the insurance things, but it is worth being aware of the fixed premium situation. It does seem to be growing, but I'm just a little bit out of date. The members of the club are the actual ship owners. Now the P&I system goes back to, I think it's 1837, up in the north of England, Newcastle area. So it's been around a while, it's been well tested, it has been well challenged in the EU. Goodness alone knows what Brexit will do to it. And I've mentioned London, Newcastle, Oslo and Arendal are the main centres in Europe, but there are centres in China. And the companies that run the P&I clubs are just a management company. So the ship owners will appoint a management company who look after their interests and the club. Most of you will be aware of the risks covered, third-party risks, and they're fairly obvious. I'm not going to go through them individually. Time does not permit, but on the next slide, oil pollution liabilities. And this is what we're talking about today. So that comes back to the P&I club. Environmental is also something that is coming to the top of the list. The environment is a great catch-all for lobbyists and others. In Southampton at the moment, there's a big movement to try and ban cruise ships using their generators while they're in port because of the fumes they put out. But all the council buses nearly are diesel, and there's talk of diesel cars being charged a congestion charge. The club will cover fines, but not the criminal. It's quite interesting. I had a case years ago, digressing just slightly, of a poor old master in a certain country was put under arrest by somebody with a machine gun and told to get his release he would have to pay $4,000 in cash. Now, I'm going back 30 odd years, so $4,000 was, a good new car to somebody. The claim came to the P&I club, and strictly speaking, it probably wasn't covered in the rules as such, but they managed to use one of the rules to repay, because poor old master, he couldn't afford it. The ship owner felt aggrieved. that they'd been forced at gunpoint. And it is a point to remember when there is an incident in certain parts of the world, the rule of the machine gun very often can take precedence over the rule of law. I'm not going to mention any specific countries, but it's a fact of life. Wreck removal, well, we've seen an awful lot of wreck removal, and that's an increasing cost to the P&I clubs. And salvage under SCOPIC. Now, we don't have time to go into the details of SCOPIC, but it's where the P&I clubs, for the first time, actually get directly involved in salvage. Not doing it, but paying for it. Now, looking at the clubs and oil pollution, ITOF, the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation Limited, it's essentially a body of scientists based here in London who will attend a pollution incident, nowadays not just tankers, and they have experience of hundreds of pollution incidents with many, many different types of oil. So they are probably the world's leading authority in how best to respond. Now, if a state or the authorities choose to ignore the advice of ITOF, then they will have to answer when they put their claim in. When they claim ridiculous sums of money for something, they might find themselves not getting recompensed because they ignored the advice given by ITOF. So it is, it's an important aspect of pollution response. The club correspondents, these are the people who represent the club locally. They will be heavily involved. They will monitor the response, and it's important that the response is monitored. I spent a lot of my field career going to spills and monitoring what was going on. And you have to be careful. Another anecdotal story, in one well-known European country, there was quite a big spill, and there were lots of oiled seabirds. And the guys would turn up about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they'd find these oiled seabirds, and oh dearie me, they'd say. Anyway, some clever person decided he was going to get down to the beach early, and he got there the next day at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he found a certain lobbying group putting on the beach pre-oiled and frozen seabirds just to try and make a point. And you know, this is something that is the harsh reality of pollution response. Lobbyists will take the opportunity to further their own case. If I tell you during the Brer incident, 4 sea otters were killed. It's not very many, but it was 4 more than. 1 was killed by the oil, 1 was killed by a TV crew driving a 4x4 across the marsh, and 2 were killed by a lobbying group, again driving a 4x4 across a marsh. So be very careful. Maybe I'm being a bit too cynical, but it is something when there is a major incident and one involving pollution, be aware that it is not always what it seems. Advising the contractors what they can do, that comes fairly obviously, and setting up a claims handling process. Now, I may say a bit more about that in a minute. Independent experts should be appointed. Now, that sounds very easy, but there are many countries in the world where the immigration authorities will be advised not to let people in unless they have a proper visa for what they're there to do. And that is quite often a device used to prevent external and genuine experts from attending the scene. One of the things we need to look at is the Civil Liability Convention. Will that be breached? What is the CLC limit, Civil Liability Convention? I do urge you again, this is something you need to look at. What happens if it's going to be breached? And this is where the IOPC funds, International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, comes in. And I'll mention them in a couple of minutes. And who has priority in the claims situation? Again, it's something when you're dealing with a casualty, you should always have a clear understanding where the priorities are. And I say that because in the UK, for example, in some cases, the authorities will go down to the bottom of the list, and the local fishermen, the local tour operators, hoteliers and so on will be given priority. So it's worth knowing in that. And the final thing there, who's in charge? Well, I've mentioned that already, but it's not always as easy to understand who is in charge. Different countries, as I say, have different systems. Under OPRC, it should be crystal clear who's in charge and what the control is. But the next one, politics versus practicalities. I don't think I need to say any more about that. But command and control. Now, after the Sea Empress case, all right, we're going back a few years, Lord Donaldson, who had already issued a report, Safer Ships, Cleaner Seas, was brought in to look at command and control. And he did, in my opinion, he did a very good job. And I'll come to that, what the results were in a minute. But as I've mentioned, there's always an opportunity to further an agenda when there's an oil spill. Actually, when there's any incident, it doesn't have to be a spill. That's what an oiled beach looks like. I'm sure you've seen TV pictures of oiled beaches. It doesn't take a lot of oil, and that is cleanup. And there's about 80 individuals in that very small area trying to clear up the oil. But even today, with all the modern technology that's available, the human element in clearing up the oil is still very much to the forefront. How else are you going to do it? On the Exxon Valdez, they used steam to try and clear the oil, to wash it away, and that actually caused more damage. So we're back to Jolly Jack and his bucket and spade clearing up the oil. And I've got no answers to that. That picture's got nothing to do with oil pollution, a lot to do with chemical pollution, but it just shows you what a blowing up ship can look like. And it's sadly in that case, some 25 people lost their lives. And again, that has to be the priority. I've mentioned most of this already, and I'm watching my time. The clubs and pollution, most of that's fairly obvious, but they deal with yacht claims, fishing claims, tourist facility, other third party, and the cleanup. And very often the cleanup costs borne by government will be paid after the tourists and the normal people, shall I say, are involved. Now, I've mentioned ITOF, and I can't stress too much that when there is a pollution incident, and nowadays it's not just oil pollution, they are involved in chemical pollution, not just for tankers, for other ships, and they are a very important resource of scientific knowledge based on what, whether it be oil or chemical, has been spilled. And you ignore them at your risk. I've said the special casualty representative, I should have just abbreviated that to SCR, because when there is a salvage operation involving SCOPIC, a special casualty representative will be appointed. And he'll be someone like me, who's got experience in ship casualties, who can liaise between the people doing the salvage and essentially the people paying for the salvage. And usually the SCR will issue a daily report, and if it's a dissenting report, in other words, if he doesn't agree, and that can happen, then he has to put his report out within 24 hours. Because there's nothing worse than somebody trying to be very clever 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years later, saying, well, this is what they should have done. But if it happens at the time, if there's a dissenting report, then it has a lot more validity. SOSREP. Now, you may have heard of SOSREP, Secretary of State's Representative. SOSREP was a direct result of Lord Donaldson's command and control. And the Secretary of State's representative, a new one's just been appointed, by the way, he has the authority of the government in matters dealing with pollution response. So if SOSREP says something can happen, fine. If he says something must happen, the local, national, regional authorities must take heed, and they don't at their own peril. SOSREP's a very powerful man during the time of response. UK, sadly, is the only country that has such a clear model. Many other countries love it. They think this is a great idea, but the waters get muddied very soon after that. And SOSREP works on the basis, when he's talking to government, back me or sack me. And that is, you know, if the government don't like what this guy's doing in their name, they can get rid of him. I have to say, it has never happened yet. It's got close, but it's never actually happened. And the guy at the bottom there, I put the media in. I haven't got time to go through the media in any depth at all, but it is worth remembering that, and I've mentioned the talk about the oil spill media coverage, the media are everywhere, and don't underestimate the resources they can throw at an incident, because TV news is big business, and they'll take a helicopter, charter it, take it to the scene, get great photographs, while the other people are humming and hawing, do we need to spend this money on getting there quickly or getting good information? So do not underestimate the power of the media. I've mentioned the fund. I've just got a couple of minutes. The IOPC funds should be put on notice if there's any thought that the Civil Liability Convention limit will be breached. And nowadays what tends to happen is that people will assume it could be breached and they will get the fund involved. The funds obviously work very closely with P&I, and they can also appoint their own representatives and experts. Indeed, I spent a number of years acting as the IOPC fund on-site representative, and that gave you no authority, but if people didn't answer your questions or you didn't like what they were doing, you could merely say, well, I don't think the fund are going to pay for this. That soon gets people's attention if they think they're not going to be paid for what they're doing. The funds carry diplomatic status. What that really means is that the guys who work at the IOPC fund here in London can get duty free. Am I being cynical? Then they work very closely with government agencies. And I've mentioned SOSREP. I've mentioned that the OPRC control model should be clear. And I've mentioned the incidents that can lead, I'll call them lobbying groups, to further their own agenda. There's nothing better to various types of groups who are trying to raise funds to have a major casualty and show that they're very important. Interestingly, we had one case where a lobbying group turned up with what was essentially a converted washing machine, And the idea was that you put the oiled birds in this machine and that cleaned the birds. Fortunately, common sense said that was never going to work, but the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty also said, they said absolutely not. You're not putting any birds in that machine. So they had to go.